Good morning, everybody. The webinar will begin very shortly. We'll just wait a couple of moments for everybody to be able to join. So good morning, everybody, from quite a nice sunny London here, and welcome to this Global Government Forum webinar, which is looking at the UK general election. I'm Siobhan Benita. I'm the Executive Advisor and Event Moderator for Global Government Forum. I'm also a former senior civil servant myself, so I spent 16 years in Whitehall. So in this session, we're going to be looking at the key policy issues that could impact in this election and beyond, as well as what civil servants are doing in government right now and how they're going to be preparing for new ministers who could arrive after the election. So, like many people, I think you may have been caught out by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's announcement of a general election. But with 1 month exactly to go until the election, I'm joined today by Richard Johnstone, who is the Global Government Forum's executive editor, and Kevin Cunnington, who is the former Director General for the Government Digital Service here in the UK, and now an expert advisor with GGF, to discuss what's happening now and how your organisation might be able to use Global Government Forum's channels and products to help communicate your organisation's messages to whoever takes power after the 4th of July, as the government sets the agenda for the next 5 years. And I think I'm right, Richard, aren't I? The first debate between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer is actually happening today. So it really does feel like we're right in the campaign now. So today, we're going to be covering the key issues of the campaign and what the next government, whoever that may be, will inherit, how civil servants will be working right now to prepare for that next government, and how manifesto policies can be delivered in government. And we're also going to cover the opportunities that GGF provide for sponsors to hear about the government's priorities and thinking post the election, and to build relationships with the public sector and officials through the events, webinars, and other activities that we offer. So first of all, let's hear from Richard on the key issues of the campaign. I'm coming over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Siobhan, and hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this session today. As you say, Siobhan, the announcement of the election came perhaps a little bit sooner than expected, but I think the contours of the campaign and the forces that are kind of shaping it have been fairly clear for a while. The overarching context, I think, for this election, and you're seeing that in the announcements the parties are making so far, is the tight public finances. We don't have a lot of information beyond what's going to happen to the public finances beyond the end of the current spending review, which finishes in March next year. And the head of the Office for Budget Responsibility, Richard Hughes, has said that that lack of information means that government spending plans at the moment, which are kind of indicative beyond that day, are worse than fiction. The overall assumption is that government revenue spending will be limited to a 1% increase in real terms in the next 4 years. But as the Institute for Government think tank has highlighted, and others have made similar points, this is inconsistent with promises to maintain the quality and coverage of public services that are being likely to come out in this election campaign, and many of which are already creaking. So I do think the election campaign is being defined by the kind of tight fiscal constraints the next government will face. We've not had manifestos yet, but we have had pledges from all three major parties, I think, major UK parties, not to increase major taxes, meaning that the next government's primarily going to be dependent on increasing revenue through economic growth and getting government to become more efficient, to get more bang for every buck of government spending. It's very clear that both the Conservatives and Labour are keen to demonstrate their fiscal trustworthiness. Yeah, I said ruling out rises in income tax, national insurance, or VAT. This being seen to be a sound custodian of the public finances is a particularly acute problem for both parties. A lot of Keir Starmer's time as leader, and particularly Rachel Reeves's work as Shadow Chancellor, has been focused on building up confidence in Labour's economic plans, whereas Rishi Sunak had the inheritance of Liz Truss's short-lived premiership, where he also has had to try and rebuild the Conservative reputation for economic competence. So I think that's one of the main areas of competition in this election, parties competing to be viewed as good custodians of the public purse. The other kind of mega trend that's topical is that the election is being fought on in a time of global uncertainty. Rishi Sunak has very much kind of focused on this in his election campaign. The speech launching the campaign was talking about how we're living in uncertain times and the need to create a secure future, whereas while only yesterday, Keir Starmer also gave a speech about national security and defence, where he warned a new age of insecurity has begun. Again, both parties are very keen to be viewed as the one who can guide the country through these choppy waters, and that's again a prism through a lot of which pledges and promises through the campaign will be seen. As for individual policies, as we said, we're not at the manifesto yet, but there's a few headlines that have come out. Labour has provided 6 first step pledges on the action it is going to take. These kind of move on from its 5 national missions that it had set out a year or so ago, and is kind of intended to show its early priorities. The Conservatives have put out a number of slightly more detailed policies in the campaign so far, including a plan to bring back a form of national service, which again you could say fits in through that prism of the campaign being focused on security. So in the weeks ahead, what should we look out for? As Siobhan mentioned, the TV debates start tonight. We can perhaps expect the issue of migration to feature highly in those, and indeed I'm more certain of that now than I was when I wrote it yesterday, given that Nigel Farage has now returned to the political fray. I think the Conservatives are keen to get credit for the development of the Rwanda plan, but albeit it's not been implemented yet, and Labour have dismissed it as a kind of gimmicky policy. As part of their security framing, Labour has pledged to cut net migration by improving training of British workers, and that's quite an interesting kind of political effort on Labour's side to move what is traditionally an issue fought on Conservative territory around border control and immigration onto friendlier Labour territory of economic growth, worker skills and wages. So that's a trick I think Labour will try to play quite a lot in the campaign, moving kind of security issues onto their happier turf. We obviously expect the issue of public services to come up an awful lot in the campaign. It's difficult at this stage to see quite how they will. There's always things that cut through an election campaign. They're very unpredictable. Both parties have made pledges, both the major parties, Conservative and Labour, on NHS waiting lists and tackling those. But there's so much kind of that goes on in the public realm, so many moving parts, that it's difficult to predict which ones will cut through in the campaign. There's a lot of recent media coverage around kind of sewage and rivers, for example, and the financial sustainability of water companies. I could easily see that becoming an issue that comes up in the debates. There's the financial peril that local government finds itself in. That's another issue that might come up. Again, from this distance, it's hard to say what issues will come up, but there will be key public service pledges that are made, and perhaps more than that, kind of key moments in the campaign that weren't planned that might cut through more widely with the electorate. And those are just some of the more kind of topical issues that you'd expect to play into this campaign. From looking at newspaper front pages, of course, what the government will inherit is an incredible panoply of long-term policy challenges in areas like net zero, to dealing with an aging population, big sort of mega trends that impact what government does. And then, of course, there's the technological developments that are coming very fast to the forefront of government minds, particularly the use of generative AI and how governments can deploy that technology to create better public services and more efficient public services, getting greater value for money. Those are big opportunities, but governments will need to proactively grapple with them. And whoever comes in next with the political capital that you have from forming a new government will have to deal with those at pace, I think, but within that tight fiscal framework and within the kind of legacy systems and workforce challenges that we know bedevil quite a lot of government transformation projects. And of course, linked to things like AI are what might be linked issues around data management and technology transitions in government. There's going to be a lot of effort there. It's just difficult right at this moment in time to see quite where the government will put their priorities. But that's where I think a lot of focus will inevitably have to be placed once ministers get into government and start to kind of look under the hood, as it were.
Richard, thank you so much. It's really good to have that kind of overview of the things we already know, the things that the parties are already saying. And I think that final point that you made there for the people who are listening today, really, really important, that regardless of all this noise around the election, whoever comes in, the civil service, the public sector are going to have to get on with delivering on all of these big challenges, and technology and getting better around managing their data and being able to meet these challenges in the most efficient way is just going to continue. It's going to get even more and more important, especially in that context of kind of tight resources. So that's not going away at all. I should have said to the audience, there'll be plenty of time for us to take questions from you once we've heard from Kevin as well. So please do you should have a Q&A button on whichever device you're using. At any point from now on, please start messaging in any questions you've got about the election process, any comments that you've got. Please do join the conversation. But I want to bring in Kevin now, because Kevin, you spent years at the centre of government. So I just want you to give us a sense, and maybe I'll come in with some of my own thoughts towards the end as well, of what civil servants are going to be doing right now during this period to prepare for whoever might come in terms of a new ministerial team post the election.
Yeah, thanks, Siobhan. I thought I'd try and do this in 3 parts. If I just explain the 3 parts, and I'll go back to the start. So there's the period from now until the election. There's the period which we call day 1 from the election onwards. And to Richard's point, this is a funny year because the election's been called early and called in summer. And I'll explain why that's a funny set of circumstances. And then Parliament will go into recess in summer, almost immediately after the election. When it comes back, I'll explain why that's probably the most important period for all of us in the cycle that we're about to enter. So right now we're in a period called PURDA for civil servants, P-U-R-D-A-H. If people want to know the etymology of that word, it's on Wikipedia. I'm not going to try and explain it myself. And PURDA is effectively a set of restrictions on ministers and parliamentarians, particularly around ministers, where ministers are discouraged from doing daily business unless it's absolutely essential. They're discouraged from they're discouraged from using their private offices to help them with electioneering. They're not allowed to use their ministerial cars, and I can tell you some funny stories about that as we go forward. And also, it affects the work going on in local elections or local authorities. Local authorities are not allowed to advertise and promote some of the good work they've been doing if it has a political kind of context to it. So effectively, government kind of stops, goes into this hybrid period, and ministers are focused on campaigning. Behind the scenes, civil servants are actively reading manifestos and pledges and trying to figure out what happens if the new government is of this shape and size. What will we need to, run around doing first day? So let's say we do have a change of government in whatever form that is. There are some significant kind of commitments to either the NHS or education. Then the Permanent Secretary for Education will be working through how she and her staff can ensure that when ministers arrive, they're already familiar with what they've been promising as part of the manifesto, and they've already got some form of planning in place. So I can have a conversation with the minister around, this is what we think we can do to support you. Does this look like we've understood what you're really trying to achieve? So it's important to recognise civil servants are actually quite busy right now doing all the planning for ministers. And then the election happens, and again, some important context here, ministers and parliamentarians will be exhausted. They'll have been on the road for 6 weeks. Every day they'll be out from very early in the morning to very late in the evening, and they arrive in the office pretty tired. So the more the civil service can do to help them from day one, the better, really. So day one, the new minister arrives. They will then have a very choreographed set of meetings that the minister's private office will have run through with the civil servants. The civil servants will have run through with their special advisors, so that we've got the right kind of threads, the right kind of actions. We know which meetings they've been in before, we know which meetings they're going on to. So it's all choreographed for the minister to make it easy for them to absorb this vast amount of information over the period of what will, I think, be a couple of weeks before we get into recess. So the elections on the 4th, first day is the 5th. Typically we go into recess, so Parliament goes on its summer break around about the 20th of July. So on my maths, people have got about 2 weeks kind of in office before Parliament breaks. Now, I think most of the parliamentarians will actually go on holiday. The ministers are unlikely to. I expect that's particularly true if it's a new government. They'll be keen to crack on. They might have a limited break, but they won't be away until September the 4th-ish, the normal 6 weeks of recess. When they come back, it's important to note, and Richard's made this point already, that we're kind of, because the election's been called early, the spending review period is March next year. So we're currently in a fiscally constrained environment for civil servants where they're having to manage on the money that they were promised by the last government, so they can't make major changes. To another of Richard's point, there are a significant number of real problems coming down the pipe for the new government, particularly around infected blood, postmasters, Ukraine. All of that is about £40 billion of unplanned expenditure that will have to be dealt with in the planning. To give you a sense of it, 40 billion is about 4% of the annual budget. So it's quite a big chunk of stuff that is already proven to be limiting the headroom for new chancellor as we go forward. And I think once we get through September, ministers will be seen out and about. It's our opportunity to start engaging with them, but don't expect them to make any particularly big announcements in and of themselves, even if it's something you've been planning with government over a period, because the period from September to December will largely be dominated by number 10 announcing things rather than departments announcing things. So September through December is our real opportunity as a community. Start engaging with ministers. That's when they'll be actively discussing their plans with us and where we can help them. I'd expect though from January they're likely to move forward, and whether that's new contracts, new commitments, new announcements, that'll be the period of activity for us beyond planning. Hopefully that wasn't too long a winded discussion about the next 3 or 4, I guess 6 months, Siobhan, isn't it?
Thanks, Kevin. No, just from my back up what you said, it is a really busy time for civil servants at the moment. So I was in Department of Health in 2010 when the coalition government came in, and in the run up to that, we had sight of the plans for the kind of NHS that the potential incoming Conservative Secretary of State for Health was going to bring in, and it took up a lot of our time trying to work through kind of those proposals. And also, one thing to note, I think, if you are a potential provider to the public sector, is those plans meant inevitably changes in the kind of team structures in the department, changes in governance arrangements. There will inevitably be changes at the top of the civil service, just because people have worked with particular ministers for a long time, and sometimes post an election it makes sense to have a refresh, even though the civil servants are impartial. So there will definitely be opportunities post-election when new teams are forming and they're thinking about new projects. That's, I think, when people will start thinking about what they need to do in terms of kind of procuring new things. There's Richard, I'm going to come back to you for any thoughts on kind of spending review, maybe, and some timings as well. But just on what you were saying, Kevin, I think it's prompted. So there's a couple of questions come in from Jasmine Coulthard, who has said, how soon can we expect public procurement to resume or new opportunities to be announced, appreciating there may be changes in priorities? And also, do you think there's any going to be more focus around providing opportunities for SMEs in particular? Richard, I'm going to come to you first, and then Kevin, for any thoughts on Jasmine's couple of questions there. I think what you were saying is it'll probably be a while, probably you're looking at kind of after summer, really, I think, for new things on the procurement side. Richard, any thoughts though on those questions first?
Yeah, on those questions from Jasmine, I've just had a look in terms of if Labour form the next government, they have a pledge for small businesses that includes a point that is again, this is Labour's phrasing. I'm not saying this is necessarily the as it is, but a fair chance at public contracts with guaranteed shortlisting for smaller firms. So there is a Labour Party policy that covers that. I think the Conservatives would say that they've done quite a lot, both in coalition since 2010 and then as a standalone government, to try and improve SME representation in procurement processes. So I don't know if there'd specifically be a kind of standalone policy that they would promulgate in their manifesto on that, as opposed to kind of championing their record and saying that they will continue with that. It's always interesting, I think, how procurement processes are structured. I mentioned this in quite a lot of these conversations, Siobhan. The Social Value Act and the different powers that government have around procurement, particularly now we're outside the European Union, there's quite a lot of discretion that can be used, and there's always differing level of appetite, I think, to use that discretion in different departments. But it's very interesting.
Thanks, Richard. Kevin, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, probably important, and I expect Jasmine knows this, but UK government has been quite proactive in supporting SMEs to the point where a third of the tech budget overall now is with SMEs, and you go back a decade and none of that was true. So we have already made substantial progress in supporting SMEs. And I think realistically, new contracts early 2025, I think personally, for the reasons we explained earlier. Nothing will really happen in recess. Ministers will be out actively engaging with people like us from September. I think by the time they've got their thinking and the procurement guys have worked their magic, it'll probably be early 2025.
Thanks, Kevin. And Richard, I did want to come back. So what Kevin was saying about the spending review, and that expires at the end of March next year. If Labour were to win, do you think they will move anything more quickly than that? Do you think they'll want to kind of have their own budget more quickly? How do you think that's going to work?
Interesting question. Rachel Reeves has said that there won't be an immediate kind of pre-summer budget. It'd be a very tight window to hit, as Kevin has laid out. But you can get away with these things when you've got the electoral wind at your back, as it were. Rachel Reeves has said that Labour would only do a budget that has been informed by an Office for Budget Responsibility economic forecast. Those take about 8 weeks or so to produce. So that's going towards the possibility of a post-election, if it still counts as post-election budget, in mid-September, which is kind of heading towards when you would expect a fiscal event anyway. There's normally an autumn statement in late October, early November. The interesting thing, and Kevin's alluded to this on the timings already, is that we are going to go straight into summer and there is a spending review pending. Does the fiscal event in the autumn, whenever that is, kick off a spending review process that is concluded by the time of the budget in March next year? Possibly, but that is quite tight then to go from budget to spending within, you know, a period of 2 weeks. Or is there something that I think this was done post-COVID, where there's essentially a rollover spending review of a year's worth of funding is kind of rolled over from what went before, to allow for a proper kind of root and branch spending review. That might be where we end up, but again, there's a risk there that you lose a little bit of political momentum. And I wonder, there'd have to be appetite for a spending review between November and March, but that might be there.
Thanks. Kevin, I'm going to come back to you in a moment because there's a question which is around kind of agile transformation. So I'm going to come to you on that one. But Richard, staying on this theme, Stuart Bell has said, I understand there have been 27 construction ministers over the last 14 years, and this has led to lots of issues with different built environment initiatives. What's the likelihood that the general election and a new government would cut schemes that are already in flight? So I think, does this tie up with a spending review, the ability to have a proper spending review? But I imagine there will also be issues around contracts that have already been awarded, which you can't get out of. Is that right? Sorry, Richard, we can't hear you. No. Maybe your connection. There we go.
I think that's better. Sorry, there's 2 mute buttons, which is
You've just pressed one again.
No, he's gone. Do you want me to put my?
I'll go to Kevin first. I'll come back to you on the other one. So Kevin, the question for you was, do you foresee significant movement towards more iterative or agile transformative delivery across government digital projects? So whilst there is a public commitment to this, and there has been for a while, most projects still remain largely a 3 to 5 year end to state programs. So do you think it's going to become more agile?
I can't tell who's asked the question, but I disagree with the premise, to be honest. I think over the last decade, we have made enormous strides towards more agile development. There's something of the order of 7,100 digital applications on gov.uk as we speak, all of which have been pretty much developed in an agile way. I think the 3 to 5 might be a bit of a red herring. We might be misunderstood because that tends to be around some of the maintenance of the larger, older systems, which is easier to chunk up like that. But most of the new stuff has really been developed using Agile, and nowadays it's maintained using Agile already.
Well, I'm going to throw you a kind of related question, Kevin, of my own, is given this context of kind of tight resources and a new government potentially coming in, whether it's, you know, a new version of the Conservative government coming in or a new Labour government coming in, wanting to kind of show that they're different, so having different new priorities, is there a risk that digital transformation gets pushed down the pecking order and that you lose some of the momentum on digital transformation? Or is it going to become more important than ever because it's the most efficient way of delivering some of these things that people want to deliver?
Well, both of your conjectures are true. There is a risk and it is more important than ever. So, you know, historically, I've said this in a number of the reports we produced, that there was this kind of spending review in 2015 where we allocated an enormous amount to digital, and I was present for that. And present at the end of that. And at the end of that, government's attitude was, do we need to spend so much more on digital again, Kevin, because we'd like to spend some more on climate? And the answer is, it doesn't work like that. You have to keep investing. And if anything, I see this being accelerated, because I think one thing we've not understood about bringing AI into the civil service is you have to constantly retrain and teach AI systems over time. So you can't build one and then just leave it. So I think, if anything, the need to invest is becoming greater. And I think there'll be a significant expectation, whether it pans out to be true or not, that AI will make a significant difference to the efficiency of government. And therefore, I think almost every party will be emphasising that when they come into power.
Thanks, Kevin. Richard, I'm coming back to you.
Yeah.
So question again about what's the likelihood that government will cut schemes that are already in place?
I think the kind of nature of a general election is that there will be increased uncertainty around schemes that have been committed to. Just to flag that, no scheme is free of uncertainty. Just look at what the government decided to do around High Speed 2 at many different iteration points in this Parliament, reducing the scope of that. It will slightly be a function of how far along in programs things are. If a project is 70% completed, it will probably be completed because the opportunity cost of stopping it is greater than the savings. If it is still on the drawing board, then it will probably be subject to a more thorough review. A lot of that kind of sizing up of where projects are and how they fit with the government's priorities will happen in that spending review process. So that will be where there could be a sorting out of stuff, and that will happen across not just construction projects and kind of built environment stuff, but across kind of the whole panoply of services and projects that a government works on. To kind of expand a little bit on Stuart's wider point about that number of construction ministers, it is astonishing, and the churn in housing ministers is similar. There's some other portfolios where it has happened a lot. There's been a lot of changes since 2010, and of course there was massive changes in the big departments of state from near the end of Boris Johnson's premiership to Rishi Sunak's one. I think, given his the value that he's putting on security and things like that, if Keir Starmer becomes Prime Minister, there will be a proactive effort to reduce the churn at ministerial level. That's always slightly difficult to do, particularly with the first cabinet. You never quite know how people are going to take to government. You never quite know which ministers are going to perform well. But I think, perhaps this is wishful thinking, but I think that we will see less churn, at least kind of over the first kind of 4 year of a parliament. If there was a Labour government, I think the Tories, if they come in, would want to do similar as well. But it's something that I think comes up a lot in these conversations, that the ministerial churn hinders good policy making and hinders good government delivery. And it sounds like an easy issue to crack, just don't reshuffle ministers that often. But the political pressure means that it still happens a lot. So that's a key issue to watch, I think.
Thanks. We've got a couple more questions on kind of understandably, given who's probably on this call, around kind of procurement and SMEs in particular. So anonymous, somebody has asked if Labour, so I think this goes back to the point you made, Richard, if Labour are pre-qualifying SMEs, is this a form of discrimination against larger organisations, and how will they ensure a level playing field? Kevin, you've got your hand up on that one.
Yeah, I think this is it may be important context for people to understand that PERDA exists as this period to level the playing fields, because as both parties or any number of parties come into an election, the incumbent government has a very privileged place in knowing what's been going on, supported by the civil service. and the opposition parties don't have quite such an informed, level of expertise. And I think this is something that's probably got lost or will get modified, because there genuinely isn't a problem with SMEs being involved in UK government procurement today. And in fact, as we said earlier, we've made enormous strides over the last decade to ensure that's happened. So I think this is one of those things that kind of comes out in this period and then gets refined as we go through, and then gets really sorted out once new ministers have access to civil servants to understand what problem are we really trying to fix, and it's the best way of going about it.
Yeah.
And just if I can come in on that access point, Siobhan, as we've all said, this election came a bit at short notice, even though we knew it was coming. Labour has had the ability to enter what are called the access talks with civil servants from, I think it was January it was announced. There was lots of reports that they were quite slow on the uptake of that. I think they expected an autumn election, so weren't really in a great hurry. They were going to use the summer to have these talks. I think there have been now some, but I was listening to a podcast the other day that had George Osborne on it, who I think still has quite good contacts in the civil service and the Conservative Party, and he said that in some departments the access talks have not started, and if they have not started now, they will not start before the election because everyone is out campaigning. So in a lot of places, just to kind of re-emphasize Kevin's point about when the value of these conversations is going to be, they're going to be starting from scratch. If Labour come in, the Conservatives, it's slightly different because they can access civil servants slightly more during the campaign exercise in the work of government. So if Labour come in, they're in the ministries where there's not been any access talks, then that will be starting from scratch, and there'll be a lot of work to do for ministers and civil servants over the summer to kind of build up the kind of relationships and the institutional knowledge as much as anything else, and then driving that out into policy priorities.
Yeah, and that was certainly my impression. I was talking to some MPs just before the election was called, and they hadn't been involved in kind of access talks yet. So I think it did take everybody a bit by surprise. Jasmine has come back saying, thanks for clarifying on those things. She's got a really good question here, and I don't know the answer to this. And if we don't between us, we could certainly go away and try and find out the answer for Jasmine. But she has said, for tenders or contracts which were active pre-PERDA but have been paused, will they also be delayed? So will they be delayed until early 2025, kind of after all the spending review and budget stuff has happened? So how quickly can you expect, if you're in the middle of a contract kind of process, for that to be resumed? Kevin, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I think there's no correct answer to this, Siobhan, because it would depend on what the contract's for. If it's something that could sensibly move ahead within the fiscal constraints of SR 25, then it could do. Equally likely, if it's larger and more difficult and maybe slightly against different policies, then it may well end up pausing until early 25.
I think
it just depends, Jasmine.
Yeah, so the answer is you won't know until after the election, but if it's not in a controversial area or then chances of it continuing quite quickly are much higher. Thanks. We have a question from Oslem, who has said, how do you think the election results impact government's smarter regulation initiatives and regulatory bodies in general in terms of digital transformation and AI adoption? So I guess this is like, how quickly is AI going to get back on the agenda, do you think, in terms of the regulation of AI post an election? Personally, I think this is going to be quite quick because everything's just moving so fast, regardless of which government comes in. They are going to want to get a grip on AI, not least because there are going to be some big risks to us if they don't. Richard, your thoughts on AI?
Yeah, I think you're right. The government has done quite a lot of work, if we're talking about the regulation of AI, and kind of setting up some institutions. There are institutions in government that are focused on that work now, and different regulators have been tasked with working together on piecing together an AI framework. Rather, it seems like the current government policy is, rather than creating an overarching AI regulator, which is probably a very cumbersome thing to do, it's bringing together the different works of the Competition and Markets Authority and the Information Commissioner's Office, and the different pieces of the regulatory state that exist to do that regulation. I slightly took Özlem's question to mean what will it mean for digital transformation and AI adoption in those regulators, as opposed to regulation of the sector. And if that is right, I just want to kind of acknowledge that, and say I always find things like how a new government deals with the regulatory state and kind of public service arm's length bodies more generally to be really interesting and really indicative of their priorities. Sometimes they are second order organizations in the way government works compared to departments and direct kind of ministerial agencies. I think there's a few hints in what Labour will do around some kind of consumer regulation. I was listening to something on the way in this morning that was talking about their regulation of ticket websites and secondary ticket retailers that they would like to put through kind of Competition and Markets Authority regulation. It can sometimes be a very clever way to make some policy changes that don't require legislation and perhaps don't require a lot of upfront money. So that is one thing I would note. I will look in the manifestos for that, because I think how governments deal with the regulatory state and how they empower those bodies is a really interesting and indicative way to look at their broader approach to government.
Thanks. Yeah, I hadn't. I see what you mean about interpreting that question in both those ways. Going back to kind of AI, because I think AI and new technology is going to be a big issue, as I said, regardless of who wins. Under this government, we've seen the UK has established itself, I think, as kind of a front runner. We've convened the big AI forum, the global kind of forum that people. Do you think that will continue? Would that be something that you could see? For example, a Labour government, were we to get a Labour government, do you think they would continue with that kind of, because I think that is an annual event now. Kevin, do you think that would carry on?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe just global context. So the best 4 countries in the world for AI are the US, China, the UK, and Singapore. So we're right at the front of this. And I think from an ethics point of view and a guidance point of view, the UK has probably been leading out of those 4 anyway. So I think we'd be foolish to give that leadership up, because a lot of the world is looking to us to help convene those meetings again in Bletchley and drive things forward. Equally, though, I think we could say this, Siobhan. GGF will produce a report on AI this year and its use in government. I think that's much more of a priority, because today we don't have lots of references for how we're going to use AI in UK government. And I think whichever government comes in June will try and take the brakes off that and accelerate it very rapidly so that we can start to use AI in making the civil service more efficient.
Thanks. Well, on that note, on kind of things that GGF are going to be doing, I just want to also come back to how GGF could maybe help you, some of our kind of potential private sector partners who are watching this, how we can help you best understand what's happening post that election and help to get in there and shape the agenda. So we host in GGF, we host a whole range of kind of in-person events and webinars like this one, where knowledge partners can be part of the panels and use and share their insights and knowledge with public servants. So a traditional panel, we would have, say, 2 kind of public servants on there and a knowledge partner as well. The key in-person event post-election, within 100 days of the election, that we are hosting will be Public Service Data Live on the 19th of September. And we've kind of all I think, agreed throughout the course of this discussion that September is going to be, I think, a key month for kind of things to start being announced and to build those partnerships. So at this Public Service Data Live event in September, civil service leaders will come together to discuss how to deliver digital transformation in the government. We had the first Public Service Data Live last year. It's a fantastic event, going to build on it again this year. So that's really the key event for organisations, I think, coming up post the election, who want to understand the priorities of the new government. We'll be hosting sessions looking at how data can be used in government, from using data to help make world-class services to how data and AI can boost public sector productivity. There's also going to be sessions on how to use data to drive more innovation in government, as well as practical steps on how to make data easier to use across and between departments, kind of managing, sharing and collaborating on that data. As I say, these sessions will include civil servants from across the UK government, so we'll provide an unparalleled opportunity to find out how that new government's agenda for public service innovation is shaping up. Then also, as part of Global Government Forum's innovation event program, so we hold a big innovation event in March, but we have lots of kind of events leading up to that. We're also going to be hosting webinars on how to make kind of transformation, innovation, digital progress happen in government, from opening up policy development to people-powered insights to the next steps for government digital transformation. So if there's a topic that any of you listening to this would like us to cover in one of our webinars, please do get in touch, because we also run bespoke webinars for our clients. I know in the chat, I think one of my colleagues, Raquel, is going to give information. If you are interested to find out any more about the things we do and the opportunities for you, you can contact Matt Hoare, who is our media sales director. So Raquel will be sharing the information with you at the moment. But we've got another question coming in on all of that. And please, if you've got any questions about the things we do, please pop those in the chat now. But Stuart has said there are significant maintenance backlogs across the public sector built estate. The published net zero targets mean significant investment in the retained estate, so existing buildings are required. Is it likely that a Labour government will retain the focus on net zero carbon and to create more budget for upgrading the legacy retained estate? Richard, you're smiling at this one slightly. I'm going to come to you on this one.
Yeah, I don't think there's any way that Labour would resile from any elements of the net zero focus. I think that will in fact become an additional priority. When I was writing the things that I wanted to touch on in this session yesterday, I did remember, and Stuart's prompted me to mention it again, the rack concrete problem that was a big story at the start of the school term about school buildings that were needing a lot of remedial work done to them because of this aerated concrete. I have to say that's one of those stories that's slightly gone quiet, but I bet it's not gone away. That there will be massive maintenance issues across the public estate. Stuart's got some figures from them there that are very interesting. There's also issues around the end of PFI contracts. A lot of the 25-30 year PFI contracts that were signed by the last Labour government will be coming up due just as the next one comes into power. So there is a lot that will be done. Capital investment, I think it dropped out of my script, but I think capital investment is again only projected to rise by a percentage point or two in the very indicative plans we have beyond the current spending review. I think Labour will want to improve that capital investment figures, and I think they will look to kind of build the political momentum to perhaps borrow to invest within their fiscal rules. But yeah, there is a lot of work to do in the public realm, I think, that the next government will inherit, but it's doing it in a way that kind of is in keeping with the fiscal pressures that they face, and indeed the capacity in the sector overall. You can't fix everything at once, so you're going to have to pick and choose.
Yeah, there's going to be a real tension, isn't it, between what a new government wants to achieve and what they are able to achieve, given the restrictions that will be in place. We didn't mention, I don't know if anybody wants to mention, because we might be in a coalition situation again, I imagine. So I guess that just adds a couple of more complications in terms of kind of, I remember from the last time there were kind of 2 or 3 days of really quite intense negotiation around, well, who would be the coalition, but also what would that mean for the coalition agreement. So we also, I guess, need to bear that in mind in terms of that might potentially add another level of complexity.
And there's never a calm moment, is there? Because the pressure around the 2010 coalition agreements was the financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis that Greece was dealing with, and I think it's now well reported that the coalition talks were being told by senior government figures while they were happening that they'd really like an announcement by Monday morning before the markets opened. So likewise, what's going on in Ukraine and Russia and the geopolitics of the moment wouldn't lend themselves naturally to a long coalition negotiation, although saying that European countries do seem to manage it quite well. But yeah, that would be an extra variable that I don't think anyone's planning for right now, but it's good to raise.
Yeah, and whoever comes in as well will be thinking about what might be happening in the American election, for example, because that could go in 2 very different directions, and that will have global consequences, policy implications as well, I think. I see we have, unless anybody has other questions, but please, if you've got other questions, do keep them coming in. But I just want to do a bit of a summary as we're getting to the end of our kind of conversation. Based on what you have both said, Kevin and Richard, I think I've taken away a couple of key lessons if I were a potential provider, a private sector partner listening to this conversation and thinking, what are the things I should be doing now? And I think the message I would take away is this is going to be a very interesting and intense period between now and maybe end of August, beginning of September. So use this period to kind of raise your profile as much as you can. Start trying, looking at the different ways that you might be able to start building relationships and getting yourself known with some of the kind of key officials, bearing in mind they might change and new teams might be being established. GGF would be one of those ways that you could do that using some of our channels. Read the manifestos, because obviously we're talking about what's already been announced, but come next week there will be a whole host of new things that will be out in the manifestos. So read the manifestos and be thinking about where might you be able to add value to some of those policies that will be announced in the manifestos, and get your narrative ready then for how you could maybe help in terms of delivering some of those priorities that are in the manifestos, and basically be prepared come September to start those conversations, I think, or have those real conversations with the new teams that are in place. They would be the key things that I have taken away. Kevin or Richard, do you want to add anything to that?
No, that's the key message, really, isn't it? Do your homework between now and September and be proactive, as the civil service is doing. And then be prepared to engage with ministers, civil servants, and people like us from September.
Yeah, and bring your knowledge as a knowledge partner of kind of how things can be done through the different approaches, and even how things can be done in government. One of the things that I enjoy about working with our knowledge partners at Global Government Forum is they often know what's going on in government, sometimes better than the government does, because they spend a lot of time in different government departments, and you can help government share best practice. You can help government share the knowledge of what works and what doesn't, and what challenges they face, and how perhaps government can work more collectively and collaboratively to solve some of the problems that we're talking about. I mean, just to name AI as one example, I know that different government departments are all doing sort of similar work on AI, and there's a great effort to join that up. Likewise on data, and that kind of effort is something where knowledge partners can be really useful in helping create those communities, and that is one of the ways that our events can help, by creating those cross-government connections with the knowledge partners.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And also, I would add to that, bring in good practice from other countries as well. If you're working with public sector organisations in other countries, we're not always that good in the UK at learning from others across kind of international boundaries as well. And also, if you can demonstrate how much money you are going to save the public sector, that would always go down well, I think, given the circumstances that we are in.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. I think that is it. We are out of questions and we are coming to the end of our time. So a huge thank you from me to Kevin and Richard for sharing all your expertise with us. As I say to everyone who is listening, we will be sending you the contact details for Global Government Forum, so you can really engage with us and help us shape some of those opportunities going forward for you to meet officials and the senior teams post the election. But for now, I think that's a big thanks and goodbye from all of us, and enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are. Thanks, Stuart. I'm glad you enjoyed the webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.